All right, thank you very much, Kaylee. And joining us now, we've got Joanna Marsh, our rail writer, coming in to join us to talk about a couple of stories. We're going to talk about weather-related things here in just a little bit. But Joanna, thanks for joining us. And unfortunately, we've got to talk about another derailment. This one, CSX in Kentucky. And I think they've come up with perhaps a fault for this particular accident. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so on Wednesday last week, a CSX train in eastern Kentucky derailed, and I think there were about 16 rail cars that were involved. Some of them did contain hazardous materials, including molten sulfur, but CSX since Wednesday, working with local responders and the Environmental Protection Agency, monitored the air quality of the region, and also cleaned up the site. Took the rail cars out. I believe as of now they have restored the tracks and the main line there, because there haven't been any operational updates since Sunday. But CSX did say that their investigation has led them to believe that a failed wheel bearing might be the cause of the incident. They didn't really say much beyond that, and as far as I can tell, there weren't any tweets from National Transportation Safety Board saying that they're sending someone over. So but that is interesting that it is a failed wheel bearing, especially since wheel bearings have had their share of the limelight this year with rail safety.
Absolutely. So, of course, that was determined to be the very likely cause of the derailment that happened in East Palestine, Ohio earlier this year as well. And it, of course, led to the discussion around that initial derailment with the Norfolk Southern train that happened back in February of whose responsibility it ended up being. And the onus was kind of being debated between, is it put on the railcar manufacturer for the quality of the wheel bearing? Is it put on the railroad to be in charge of the inspections and making sure that these bearings are up to standard? Did we ever figure out where that blame kind of lies? And does the discussion that we saw in February with the Norfolk Southern incident now have any bearing on what happens with CSX?
Yeah, sure. So, those are good questions. On one hand, I don't think there has been any, at least publicly, there hasn't been sort of any declaration in terms of this is, it's the rail car owner's responsibility, or the railroad's responsibility. I think that's I think that's still something that is done on a case by case basis, but at least the perhaps maybe the public exposure to the issue kind of helps in the sense of trying to figure out how to ensure that the physical rail car is functioning as it should. So I don't think there has been, as far as I'm aware of, I don't think there has been any sort of public declaration saying that it's the rail car owner or the railroad. It's hard to say because the CSX said that it was a failed wheel bearing, but there wasn't really any more explanation beyond that, so it's hard to really sort of say any more beyond that failure could be purely mechanical. I think with the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, that was a sort of an overheated bearing, and so so it's kind of hard to say, but I think given this past year with East Palestine and the rail safety legislation that hasn't moved forward, but the industry and rail car owners, so rail car shippers, rail shippers, we're looking at. I think it's at least brought it to the attention of industry stakeholders in terms of ensuring the health of the rail cars.
Joanna, let's move on to the FRA and what they're doing in terms of trying to bolster things with possibly severe weather-related accidents. We've heard just a little bit about lake effect snow and, of course, what that can do. But right now, what are the main concerns right now the FRA has about bolstering those standards to make sure that things are safe when rail cars encounter severe weather?
Yeah, sure. So I think the impetus is that, obviously, weather impacts can impact can impact rail operations, and it seems more so in Canada, but it seems even in the U.S. that these unusual weather events have affected operations lately. Of course, you had, I think when I first started at FreightWaves, there was some flooding issues in the Midwest, and then of course most recently you had some more flooding issues because of the hurricane that happened on the West Coast, and then you have the wildfires in California, and of course you have the hurricanes that happen every year. And then you had that extreme cold weather that happened, was it like 2 or 3 years ago, like in Texas? So, and all those things affected rail operations. And I think essentially the Federal Railroad Administration issued a safety advisory recently saying, one, look at your existing training programs and make sure that they're okay. Two, if there is technology out there that can, that takes in weather data and can and if you can take that weather data and integrate it into your operations, that'd be really good. And three, is there some not necessarily industry best practices, but is there a way that that the railroads individually can learn from each other about how they incorporate that weather data into their operations. And so I think those are helpful suggestions, especially, I was thinking about it, especially if climate resiliency will be an issue, as things go forward with climate change. Like, I feel like this is an intermediate step in terms of, addressing how to make the network resilient now versus 3 to 5 to 10 years from now, which of course is still important too, but you have to take steps now in order to protect the network in the future as well.
I love hearing this conversation because when it comes to setting weather operation standards, it's a very difficult one because weather is something, and weather response is something that is a very type of internalized risk assessment that a lot of people do, right? Like, I might not feel comfortable driving in heavy rainfall, but you might feel comfortable driving in heavy rainfall. And it's that very delicate balance of passing regulation or minimum operating standards that are good for safety, but don't necessarily infringe on some of those personal feelings that you have about safety to operate. Do you think that this is maybe a conversation specifically for the rail industry because everything else is so standardized? You have, the amount of conductors in a rail car. You have those tracks you really can't get off of. You can't necessarily pull over and take a break if you're encountering heavy snowfall or heavy rainfall like you could in a truck. And is that a conversation that we really need to focus on?
It's a good question too. I wonder, how much of it is that dialogue internally within the railroad and also within the industry, which is also, I think, probably a dialogue worth happening or worth having. But also, how much of it is also the government's way of ensuring that something is being done. For instance, in Canada, the Canadian government has required Canadian Pacific and CN to provide winter operating plans, and I think they've actually asked for it since last year because of bad weather that was happening bad winter weather that was happening in Canada. And of course that bad winter weather happens every year. And it's interesting because CN, when they gave its report to the government this year for the 2023-2024 winter, they're saying, well, actually, they were talking more about like how it was sort of a backdoor way of saying, all the regulations that you're putting on us might affect how we operate in the winter. But I wonder too if coming back to going back to the U.S., like how much of it is that dialogue, which is helpful to have, but also how much of it is the appearance that that the government is doing something, but also the appearance that they just want to make sure that the railroads are keeping an eye on the issue as well. Although, like I said, I mean, I'm sure that having those weather-related technologies incorporated into your operations would help, would only help.
Certainly a very interesting conversation, and I think your observations is definitely a good one. If you're not used to driving in snow, thinking about Floridians, they don't necessarily do that there as well. Joanna, thanks so much for joining us.
All right, thank you. Have a good week.
All right now we're going to go ahead and take a quick break. We'll be back with more FreightWaves Now right after this.